Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Carlson, a director here at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's event. This is our 2022 Hardt-Nickachos Lecture in Peace Studies, and it is great to see you. Thank you for coming out in spite of this kind of wacky weather. And if you hear like a really intense thundering sound, it's actually not the weather, it's not my stomach growling for missing lunch, and it is not the voting gods out there fulminating in the skies. It's actually a new building being built next door. So rest assured, it's all normal, it's all okay, but you will hear some occasional sounds or feel some sensations, and you can take that as the movement of the spirit or whatever you like, or maybe just the insights of our lecture today penetrating and giving us inspiration as well. Just a couple housekeeping matters. Please, if you would, remember to silence your cell phones. And we are live streaming our event today, so welcome to all of our viewers online, and a special welcome and greetings to our esteemed friend of the Center, Ann Hart, who has endowed this Peace Studies program and lecture series. Yasmin will say more about Ann in just a moment, but if you're watching from home, Ann, we're thinking of you and honoring your gift to us today. So. I also want to take a moment to introduce our newest member of our center team. Alexandria Brooks is in the back here. Alex, she is our new event coordinator, and we are thrilled to have her because we have a lot of events, and we've been doing all of these events without an event coordinator, if you can believe that. So it's great to have her on board. She's already making a tremendous impact. We're so thrilled to have you here, Alex. And please introduce yourself to her, and you will see her around and hear from her in the coming weeks, months, years. We have one more public event this fall. I want to quickly note, you may have seen reference to it, on Thursday, November 17th at 1:30 p.m. here in West Hall, 135, where we are now. We're going to be featuring a lecture entitled, "Is the United States a Democracy or a Republic?" You sometimes hear some discussion of this in the media. It's not always very well-informed discussion. I assure you that this lecture will be well-informed. It's going to be given by Anand Gopal, who is a professor here at the Center, a research professor here at the Center, winner of multiple awards in journalism, and someone who knows quite a bit about efforts of different peoples around the world to self-govern themselves and what that looks like, based upon his own reporting in many conflict zones in the Middle East and elsewhere. So more information about all of our events, video, you can find our YouTube channel, past events, all of that is available on our center website. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and apparently now LinkedIn, as well as Instagram. We are available on all platforms. There's no way you can miss us unless you don't do any of those platforms. So, the date for the lecture is November 17th, at 1:30 p.m. All right, with that, I'm going to get out of the way and introduce Yasmin Saikia, who is our Hardt-Nickachos professor in Peace Studies and professor of history in the school and here in the center, and we are delighted to have you welcome our lecture, or our special lecture today. So, Yasmin.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon. I'm Yasmin Saikia, and I hold the Hardt-Nickachos Chair in Peace Studies, and I'm a professor of South Asian history at the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies, big name, and we do small work. But thank you so much for coming. This is after a very long time. I think the last time we had our public event for Peace Studies was in 2019. So thank you so very much that you have come in person to join us and to have this wonderful occasion to listen to Professor Livingstone, who will be talking on issues of dehumanizing and how to get beyond that. But in order to do these lectures and these events that we do in Peace Studies, we are very fortunate to have received the initial grant from Emeritus Professor Ann Hart, who started the project of asking us to start thinking about peace and how do we do peace in this very conflictual world. So I hope Anne is able to see us. Anne is currently quite advanced in her years, but she takes a very strong interest in what we do. So Anne, if you're watching us, and you can see so many of us here, and your work has really borne fruit, and we are really glad that so many of you are here to also celebrate not just Anne, but everything else that we do here. Several of you also know that you're already friends of our Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. If you have not yet become a friend of this center, we would urge you and encourage you to become a friend so that we can continue to share all the events we do here. We also have little Helen, who has come all the way from London. So she is our newest member of our Peace Studies initiative here. I would like to actually also take a brief moment here to also talk about a workshop that will follow this lecture that some of us, like 12, 13 of us, are gathering together to discuss the question of minorities and belonging across in the US and globally. So that will be something that we'll be doing for the next 2 days. Thank you so much, the participants who have come from all over to join us on this, and we hope we'll have a very fruitful conversation for the next couple of days. I want to take a couple of minutes now to introduce our keynote speaker or plenary lecturer for the conference and the annual Peace Lecture, Professor David Livingstone Smith. Professor Smith is a professor of philosophy at the University of New England and is a leading expert on dehumanization. As he told us this afternoon over lunch, that everyone in his department knows him as the person who does dehumanization. So, you know, it's a big thing. To do dehumanization, you just cannot do it from one single discipline, although his original training is in philosophy. He's an interdisciplinary scholar. So people like me, who's a historian, others who are legal scholars, anthropologists, and a variety of different disciplines actually read his work and have been inspired by the kind of writing that he has done over many books. Like there are at least 10 books that I have seen. And for the last, I think, 12 years or so, you have been working on dehumanization. More like 17 years that he has been working on this topic. So he has really honed it and has gone to great depths. 3 of the books that I have particularly paid attention, the newest one being Making Monsters, The Uncanny Power of Dehumanization, is something I need to read. It just came out last year. But there are a couple other books that have greatly influenced our own research on peace and how to think of peace. One is Less Than Human, Why We Demean, Enslave, and Exterminate Others. And the other book is on Inhumanity, Dehumanization, and How to Resist It. In fact, it was Professor Livingstone's work that Professor Chad Haynes and I, who had been co-editing 3 books on the question of people's peace, had been able to include it in our work and had been actually quite inspired by that work on Inhumanity, the book Dehumanization and How to Resist It, because he brought to our attention something very important. He asked us to think in that book, how do we grapple with our own selves, that we are all somewhat culpable and involved in othering people and dehumanizing. We don't think of it ourselves, but it happens. We are manipulated through political and other kinds of tools to see the other as something less than us and sometimes less than human. And so in the process, what it made us think, people who are doing peace studies work, is to think about how each individual is actually responsible to create the space and the possibilities of peace and not wait for some international organization or some large institution to deliver peace. So it's a moral instruction as well as a reflection to think about our individual role as perhaps peace actors. And when we cannot perhaps work in a group, we can still do something to humanize not just others, but also ourselves. Because only when we humanize ourselves, we see the humanity in the other. And this is a question that Professor Livingstone had made me think about when I was writing the final book, which will be coming out next year on the question of people's peace, called on Othering, Processes and Policies of Unpeace. And it's coming out in spring 2023. And so I'm very, very fortunate that when I invited Professor David Livingstone to come and deliver a lecture, the annual Peace Lecture, he very willingly accepted, and I'm delighted to welcome him. So please join me in welcoming Professor Livingstone to this annual Peace Lecture and to enjoy the talk. Thank you.
I think
You already
I'm
have
wired
one.
for
You are
sound
wired.
here.
Yes.
Well, thank you for coming out. I hope it's worthwhile for you all. As Jasmine said, I've been working on dehumanization for some time. And it's an interesting thing, you know, that the word dehumanization is used a lot. You could Google it, and you're going to get, I would guess, something like 8 million hits. But if you look at those hits, what you'll find is the word is used in quite different ways from one instance to the next. The word dehumanization doesn't have a fixed meaning. It was introduced into the English language in 1819. And since its introduction, it has accumulated a number of different meanings. It's not that some are right and some are wrong. It just has a lot of different meanings. So if we're trying to theorize dehumanization, we need to be clear about what we mean by it, or else we're going to talk past each other. So here's what I mean by it. Dehumanization is the attitude of conceiving of others as subhuman creatures. Now notice, I didn't say subhuman animals. Often when we think of dehumanization, we think of references to others as rats or lice or wolves or other sorts of predators, and invariably in situations of conflict or domination. And that's the line I took in my first book, Less Than Human, which came out, my first book on dehumanization, which came out in 2011. But since that time, I've made some modifications to my views. And I've concluded that the most dangerous, the most toxic, the most lethal form of dehumanization is not so much the form of dehumanization that would regard others simply as less than human animals, but as monstrous and demonic beings. And that former kind of dehumanization, for reasons which I hope I have time to explain adequately. It's always dangerous getting me to speak on a topic that I'm so absorbed in, and which I think is so important for 40, 45 minutes, right? I have to be very disciplined here. I'm going to give you some sense of how that works and why the former sort of dehumanization tends to revert to the latter. So dehumanization often starts with thinking of others as less than human animals. And that's a phrase itself which requires some analysis. What do we mean by less than human, right? But there are features of human psychology that lead that to morph into regarding the dehumanized other as a monstrous, demonic being, an evil being. And that in turn justifies the terrible atrocities that come in the wake of dehumanization. And I will be talking a bit about terrible atrocities. So, fair warning. So let's get into it. Oh, look at that. That's a nice Halloween-y theme, isn't it? It's a still from the 1941 movie The Wolfman. It was a big budget for the time movie, and it has an interesting backstory. So it's your classic werewolf tale. The man who wrote the screenplay, that I'll introduce to you in a moment, was like the king of Hollywood B-movie horror flicks. And this was his most significant film. And it's his best film, really. You know, it's better than The Wolfman Meets Frankenstein and other masterpieces that he wrote for. It's a film with actually, unless you know something about the historical circumstances, you don't appreciate its depth. So, as I said, it came out in 1941. What does that say to you? What was going on in 1941? The war. Yeah. And the man who wrote the screenplay for this is a man named Kurt Siodmak. And Siodmak was a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany. He fled to the United States after France and Switzerland, ended up in the United States, ended up in California in 1933, which is the year that Hitler came to power. And late in life, in an interview, he made the following comment: "I am the Wolfman. I was forced into a fate I didn't want, to be a Jew in Germany." The Wolfman, the film, is kind of a tragic film. There's a man who has the misfortune of having been attacked by a werewolf. And he is then transformed into a werewolf, and he cannot help himself, right? He can't escape this tragic fate, that he's a good guy, but he ends up killing people. There are various hints in the film that this has something to do with the fate of Jews in Nazi Germany. For instance, the mark of the werewolf in the film is a star on the palm. It's not a Star of David, but it's close enough, right? And there are a few other hints. In the same interview, he said, the moon is the swastika. You know, the man turns into the wolf with the full moon. So when that moon comes out, he, the Wolfman, which he's identified with himself, is overtaken by a fate over which he has no control. So we could say that Siodmak, as a Jew, experienced himself as being transformed into a dangerous animal by the persecutors of him and persecutors of his people. But this idea of the monstrous werewolf is pretty close to how Nazis represented Jews in the lead up to the Holocaust and beyond, during the Holocaust itself. Here are a couple of examples. These are really interesting examples. These are two examples of Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda. And what I want you to note looking at these, well, let's look at the first one there, the one on the left. That's a Danish propaganda poster, Nazi Danish propaganda poster. It means rats, destroy them. But what we see isn't just a rat. What we see is a curious hybrid. It's a rat with a caricatured Jewish man's head. Now, imagine it was just a rat. Well, we can have all kinds of attitudes towards rats. My grandmother, who was a Jewish refugee from Eastern Europe and grew up in a rat-infested building in New York City in poverty, was terrified of rats because they'd come and nibble her at night. My daughter had pet rats. She loved them. She thought they were cute. So you can have a variety of attitudes towards rats. But I can guarantee you, if something like this crawled into this room, you would find it very, very disturbing. This is a monstrous image, rat and human. Likewise, the second one, der Jude tarnt sich, the Jew camouflages. This was a feature of anti-Semitic propaganda, not just in Nazi Germany, but for some time before, that Jews hide their true nature. They can't be discerned from Gentiles. So deep down on the inside, there's something else. They're counterfeit humans, as it were. So both of these are monstrous images. And this is a absolutely standard theme, not only in Nazi dehumanizing anti-Semitism, but for a long time before. If you look at the history of anti-Semitism and its roots going back as far as the 13th century. My latest book, I have a chapter all about that. We find the same basic themes, which are then weaponized in Germany, say in the immediate aftermath of World War I. That's when we get political anti-Semitism in Germany, and really weaponized when the Nazis get to power in the 30s. But it's not just this turning people into monsters is not just a Nazi phenomenon. It's not just an anti-Semitic phenomenon. It is characteristic of situations in which dehumanization occurs. So if that's Exhibit A, this is Exhibit B. Does anyone recognize that picture? Evidently not. This is Waco, Texas, 1893, February 3rd. This is a lynching. This is a lynching of a man named Henry Smith. And it's what was known as a spectacle lynching. Spectacle lynchings, so the impression you get about lynchings in the movies and on TV are extremely misleading. Consequently, in my experience, most Americans don't understand lynching. So in the movies on TV, here's what happens. Like half a dozen guys with the Ku Klux Klan, Halloween gear on, ride up to someone's house, drag a black man out of the house, and hang him. Lynchings were far, far worse than that. So let me tell you a little bit about this one. First, I want you to notice the crowd. There are between 15 and 20,000 spectators here. This was a big deal. Lynchings like this were publicly advertised. Railroad companies laid on extra trains to transport spectators to the lynchings. There were professional photographers on hand to take pictures and then sell them as postcards. They were not simply extrajudicial executions. They typically involved hours of torture, bodily mutilation, and very often the victim was then burned alive and burned slowly. I warned you. I will not go into the grisly details here, but it is the worst treatment you can imagine being meted out to a human being. So this man, Henry Smith, he was a mentally disabled farm worker. He was accused of murdering and raping a child, the sheriff's daughter. He was apprehended, allegedly confessed, and one mustn't trust those reports. Paraded around town on a float, dressed as a king to mock and humiliate him, then taken up to that platform, which had to be moved out of town because there were too many people, and tortured and then burned alive. Now, when you read about these things, I read and write a lot about lynching. It's unavoidable to sort of ask yourself, how could people do that? I mean, when you, which I'm sparing you, when you take in the full horror of these things, like, it boggles the imagination. But people did. These were ordinary people. This was a festive occasion. This is men, women, and children. Schools are closed so the kids can attend. Saloons are closed. It's a festive event. How does that happen? Well, one of the things I do when I research lynchings is I go to old newspaper reports. Go to the old newspapers and look at how these events are described, and in particular, I'm interested in how the victims are described. Here's a selection. Incarnate monster, New Orleans State. Unnatural monster, Texarkana News. The most inhuman monster known in current history, the New York Sun. Fiend incarnate, Vance. Vance was there, and he wrote a book about the lynching. Monster in human form, cited in Dre. Dre wrote quite a good book on lynching, but he doesn't always give his sources. So what we find here is this brutal treatment, this unimaginably brutal treatment, paired with characterizations of the victim as a monstrous entity. And of course, if you're dealing with a monster, think of the monsters of our, think of the Wolfman. There's no mercy. There's no room for compassion. It's brutal. It's the stamping out of evil. Now, this sort of characterization was not limited to lynching victims. This sort of characterization was often given in the United States to African Americans, and particularly, and this is very significant, as you'll see, African American men. So here's another example. And this is from a book called The Klansman. It was published in 1905 by a man named Dixon. It was part of a trilogy, and it was eventually became the basis of a very famous movie called The Birth of a Nation, which came out in 2015, which was the inspiration for the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, the second Ku Klux Klan, which was by far the most successful edition of the 3 editions of the Ku Klux Klan. There were 3 of them, and the most horrific. So there we go. That's a still from the movie. That's the character Gus, who is the bestial, monstrous, rapist black man, played by a white man, of course. And so let me read this paragraph to you. This is really a slightly edited version, extract from an article I recently wrote. Gus, who rapes a white teenage girl, has, quote, gleaming ape-like eyes, end of quote. And his, I won't say quote, end of quote anymore, thin spindle shanks supported an oblong protruding stomach resembling an elderly monkey's, which seemed so heavy it swayed his back to carry it. These are excerpts from the book, The Klansman. The animal vivacity of his small eyes and the flexibility of his eyebrows, which he worked up and down rapidly with every change of countenance, expressed his eager desires. Reenacting his sexual assault, Gus's thick lips were drawn upward in an ugly leer, and his sinister bead eyes gleamed like a gorilla's. A single fierce leap, and the black claws clutched the air slowly as if sinking into the soft white throat of his victim. So he's a monster, right? I can't begin to express to you how standard this sort of description was. Right? And we're in the 20th century here now. So one thing you may have noticed, I'm sure you noticed, but you might not have registered it, is both of the examples that I give are racialized examples. In fact, these are my 2 paradigmatic examples that I use, say, in my last book, Making Monsters: anti-Semitism and anti-black racism. So, given that, well, why do I use them? Because dehumanization, the most maybe that's not quite right. The sort of dehumanization that leads to genocidal violence and extreme atrocity is very intimately tied with racialization. And by racialization, I mean conceiving of a group of people as a race. I'm one of these philosophers. I don't believe in race. I think race, the idea of race, is one of the most evil human races, yes. I don't believe in human races. It's one of the most evil notions that our minds have fashioned. But that's irrelevant. You can believe in race, you cannot believe in race, but we all have to believe in racialization. We have to believe that people are racially categorized. So then to dig into dehumanization, of this sort anyway, and there are several sorts, we need to look into how racialization works. And I have some views on that. So let's go through these 4 points here. Groups of people who are dehumanized as monsters are almost always first racialized. Racialization precedes dehumanization. Sometimes I call dehumanization racism on steroids, because it's not ordinary everyday racism. It's racism brought to the next level. To racialize a group of people is to, first, regard them as fundamentally and unalterably different from us, whoever us happens to be. 2, regard them as intrinsically inferior to us. And 3, regard this status as transmitted biologically, mainly by descent, but there are some interesting variations on that if we look cross-culturally. When people are racialized, they're seen as lesser human beings, paving the way for them to be seen as less than human. So that's, in my work, that's a very important distinction. We can denigrate people. We can see them as inferior human beings. But for me, that stops short of dehumanization. It's bad, for sure, but it's not the same. The way I use dehumanization, when we dehumanize others, we exclude or attempt to exclude them from the category of the human altogether. It's an attempt which always fails. But paradoxically, that leads to some of the most toxic consequences of dehumanization. Although they appear human, dehumanized people are thought to be subhuman on the inside, counterfeit human beings. So when people, right, so dehumanization doesn't work like this, right? So some people see a bunch of other people and they look really different and they act really different and they think, oh, they must not be human. That's not how it works. And it's certainly not something that arises spontaneously in the human mind. I'll get onto that as well. Dehumanization, like race, this is actually really important, is not primarily about outward appearance. It's about an idea of what people are on the inside. On the inside. The outward appearance is taken to be merely symptomatic of what they are on the inside. I was wanting to actually make a slide of a picture of my maternal grandmother, who was Jewish. And let me tell you about her. She had very pale skin. She had steely blue eyes and extremely blonde hair. That would not have saved her from the ovens of Treblinka had they not emigrated earlier, before the Holocaust. Right? The appearance, it may be indicative, but it's not what it is to be a member of a certain race. That's part of the logic of passing, too, in this country, right? Okay. So let's get to some illustrations. I want to use 2 illustrations separated somewhat by geography and certainly separated by history. And here's the first. It's a text which came out in 1680 called, well, it's one of these long 17th century titles that goes for a full page. The Negroes and Indians Advocate suing for their admission into the church, or blah, 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 by a guy named Morgan Godwin. Morgan Godwin was an English cleric who, after graduating from Oxford University, where he studied under John Locke, sailed to Virginia, promptly got himself in trouble with the establishment there, left and went to Barbados and got himself in trouble there. And when he got to Barbados in particular, Barbados was, a wealthy sugar colony, British sugar colony, and it was extremely brutal. And enslaved Africans were excluded from religious education. They could not gain admission to the church, and there was an interesting reason for that. The Brits were uncertain if it was legitimate to enslave Christians. So you got to prevent them from being Christians, right? Because then you might have to give up your slaves. So they prevented them from becoming Christians. And Godwin, who was a very religious man, was appalled by that. He wasn't an abolitionist, like there weren't abolitionists in 1680. But he was also appalled by the brutality inflicted on these people. So he publishes this booklet. It's really powerful. It's really, really good. So we're going to draw on that, and we're going to draw on this. Der Untermensch, which is German for the subhuman, was published in 1942 by the SS Publishing House under the supervision of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS. Tasteful little number. And what I want to show you is some striking similarities between Godwin reporting on attitudes towards enslaved Africans and the authors of Der Untermensch characterizing Jewish people. So here they are, Godwin and Heinrich Himmler. Let's start with Godwin. Quote, "The Negroes, though in their figure they carry some resemblances of manhood, are yet indeed no men." Now, I want to be clear, Godwin does not believe this. He is reporting on what he's been told. Okay, so what do we have here? Remember my phrase, counterfeit humans? Well, they're outwardly human, though in their figure they carry some resemblances of manhood, yet are no men. They're not really human. Now let's go to Himmler. Quote, "Not all of those who appear human are in fact so. Woe to him who forgets it." End of quote. That was a popular Nazi slogan. It was based on an old German saying, probably centuries old, and was introduced into the Nazi literature by Carl Schmitt, the jurist and political theorist, in the 20s. So you see the similarity there, I hope. It's quite striking. And, of course, I am cherry picking because these are very explicit examples, but we find this throughout the historical literature, this sort of bifurcation of human appearance, subhuman essence. All right, let's go on. Africans are, quote, "creatures destitute of souls, to be ranked among brute beasts and treated accordingly." So having a soul, that was the idea at the time of what it was to be human. So if they're destitute of souls, they're not human, and therefore they have the same status as the brute beasts. And let's slip over to the Nazi one. Although it has features similar to a human, the subhuman is lower on the spiritual and psychological scale than any animal. Jews are beasts in human appearance, so we have the same idea, expressed slightly differently. So in my books, I describe lots and lots and lots of this stuff. Monster theory. Okay, so if people are thought to be monsters, well, what is it? What is a monster? There is actually a discipline called monster theory. But here I'm drawing on a particular contributor to work on monsters, a philosopher named Noel Carroll, who wrote a wonderful book called The Philosophy of Horror. It's a real page turner. I mean, let's face it, most philosophy books are really, really boring. This one isn't. It's a lively read. And again, in my books, I go much more deeply into this, drawing on literatures going back to the early 20th century on the uncanny, on notions of the natural and the unnatural and so on. But I'd have to be here for hours to really get into that stuff. So Carroll argues monsters have two properties. To be a monster, the job description is twofold. Monsters have to be dangerous. They seek to kill, harm, or destroy. He says they're physically threatening. Like a nice monster isn't a monster, right? You know, that's the difference between Casper the ghost and the other bad ghosts. Second, and this is key, because the first one is compatible with all kinds of beings that aren't monsters, right? They just have to be physically dangerous. Monsters are impossible fusions of incompatible things. They violate the order of nature. So think of the wolf man. The wolf man is wolf and man. You can't be a wolf and a man. That's the impossible fusion. Think of zombies. That's a good one. Zombies are both alive and dead. You know, they walk around, they try to eat your brains, so they have metabolisms, but they're decaying corpses, right? So when you get these combinations, these contradictory beings, it elicits a certain kind of response, psychological response, which is extremely disturbing. And when we conjoin these two, physically dangerous, malevolent, and impossible, that's how we get the monster. Okay, so next. We're now moving to gender. Now it's interesting, for years when I was working on dehumanization, I didn't realize how gendered it is. Even though all the most horrible cases involve males. Somehow I didn't notice that. I had to read the work of another scholar, a man named Tommy Curry, who's basically founded the discipline of black male studies, in order to say, wow, this is the case. So the illustration is a sculpture called Raise Up from the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, which is basically a lynching memorial. Here are some facts about lynchings. There were 4,467 recorded lynchings between 1883 and 1941. The 20th century was big lynching time, right? Or the early decades of the 20th century. If you have it in your head, lynching was something from the 19th century only, you got to revise that. And in the 20th century, by the way, they were advertised on the radio to get the crowds in. 73% of the victims were African Americans. Of the 4,467 lynching victims, 4,027 were men. Only 99 were women, and the gender could not be determined for 341 of them, although these were probably men. If we exclude the latter from consideration, it turns out that 97% of those lynched were men. In the South, practically all of them were African American men. So here we've got this confluation of gender and race, right? Associated with this atrocity of lynching. And I've already, perhaps I shouldn't say demonstrated to you, but conveyed to you that lynching itself was bound up with dehumanizing characterizations of the victims. We find something similar in lethal anti-Semitism. So the quote on the top is from Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels. He characterized the Jew as the son of chaos, gendered word, son, the son of chaos, the incarnation of evil, the demon who brings about the degeneration of mankind. So again, we have gender conjoined with monstrousness. The illustration is a Dutch movie poster advertising the German profoundly anti-Semitic propaganda film, The Eternal Jew, that says De Eeuwige Jood there, and that, I'm sure you will all agree, is a monstrous image. Look, I'm Jewish, I don't look anything like that, right? I hope. So, to test the hypothesis that the demonic dehumanization of Jews was strongly biased towards men. Now, I'm not saying that women weren't dehumanized, they were. But I'm talking about a particular form of dehumanization, the transformation into monsters and demonic beings. My former student, Emily Birdsall, examined the representation of Jews as demonic or monstrous in Nazi visual propaganda. So she and I went through all the material we could find. Nazi propaganda posters, cartoons, illustrations from Der Stürmer, and stuff. She found that in every case where the Jewish person's gender is specified, the monstrous or demonic Jew is male. We could not find a single example of a Jewish woman presented as a monster. There are plenty of examples of Jewish women presented as repugnant, but not as monsters. So there's something about this monstrousness which is highly gendered, at least in these two examples. Of course, there may be other examples. I'm thinking, for example, of the witch persecutions, which I've never really properly studied. I'd like to get onto that. Okay, so why does this happen? Very briefly, because I'm running out of time here. Again, my books, particularly my last book, goes into this quite a bit. Here's why dehumanization, what I call dehumanization of the first sort, that is, when people are represented as subhuman animals, so often reverts to turning them into monsters and demons. Seeing human. Here's a fact about our species. This is an uncontroversial fact. Homo sapiens are what biologists call ultra-social. There is no mammal that is remotely as social as human beings, as is evidenced by this group of strangers in this room here, all participating in something. We are exquisitely sensitive to indications of humanness in one another, particularly the side of a human face, and more particularly the side of a human pair of eyes. When confronted with another member of our species, normally, there are exceptions, up close and personal, you just can't help seeing human. And one of the things that does is it inhibits violence. That would take a lot of time to explain. Maybe in the Q&A we'll get into that. So here, on one hand, let's say you're a bunch of Nazis. Hopefully none of you are. I don't know. I don't know how many Nazis there are in Arizona. Quite a few in New Hampshire. Yeah, okay. Right, and I said I'm a Jewish guy. My mother was Jewish, despite my hyper-Christian name from my father. You look at me, and whatever ideology you have, you cannot help see me as a human being. You cannot help it. But it is often in the interests of propagandists or people in positions of power and influence to convince us to see groups of others as subhumans. Remember I said dehumanization doesn't just pop into the human mind. People don't just wake up and say, those are monsters. And this is again something I didn't grasp when I wrote my first book on dehumanization. Every example that I've studied, dehumanization is revved up by propaganda. It's revved up by people that we invest with a certain kind of epistemic authority. People who are supposed to know, telling us, you can't trust your eyes, guys. By analogy, look at this podium here. Well, it looks pretty gapless, but the physicist is going to tell me it's mostly empty space. The physicist is supposed to know, so I take that on board, even if it doesn't match what my eyes tell me. Similarly, Joseph Goebbels was supposed to know, and people defer to Joseph Goebbels. People defer all too often to those with toxic political agendas to get us to see others as less than human. But now look what happens. Oh, first, here's an example. This is from the courtroom. Let me read this to you. And I'm about to wrap up. So organizers, don't freak out that I'm going to go on forever. I'm about to wrap up. This is from John Hagedorn's book, Gangs on Trial, Challenging Stereotypes and Demonization in the Courts. It's a good book. The dehumanization of non-white gang members underwrites the logic of mass incarceration. If the defendant is less than human, the jury, the court, and the law itself washes its hands of his fate. If he's inherently evil, he can't be reformed. So, of course, we should lock him up forever if we can't put him down. Through the power of prototypes, while an actual human being stands before the court, the prosecution frightens the jury to see instead a scary monster or bloodthirsty animal. So there's the power of influence. An act of persuasion is required, and the skillful prosecutor can persuade. But under the circumstance I've just described, think of what happens then, in my view. This is like really central to my account of dehumanization. On the one hand, we cannot help see others as human, most of us, when we're up close and personal with them. On the other hand, we defer to the authority, insofar as we dehumanize others, the authority with a toxic political agenda, that they are less than human. And this gives us two contradictory images of the other, as human and as subhuman. And that's halfway to turning them into monsters. That's the impossible combination, like the wolf man. But there's one more thing that needs to be addressed. Why males? I've argued that this form of dehumanization is highly gendered, and it tends to be males who are turned into monsters. Well, recall that monsters must be physically dangerous. In racist ideologies, it is men who are overwhelmingly represented as essentially violent and criminal, rapists, murderers, etc. Combine this with the view of dehumanized men as simultaneously human and subhuman, and they are transformed into monsters, extremely threatening embodiments of evil. Now, the organizers asked me to end on an upbeat note. I'm not good at upbeat, I'm sorry. But I do address what's to be done. So this is discussed mostly in, not my last book, but the one before that, on Inhumanity. So what can we do? I mean, this is an awful thing. Words like never again are really cheap. Here are a few things. First, learn how dehumanizing propaganda works. I haven't had time to get into that, but if you're talking about this kind of influence, you have to understand how propaganda works, particularly these very dangerous forms of authoritarian propaganda. Learn how people in positions of influence manipulate us by playing on our fears and vulnerabilities. Take political action to reduce objective vulnerability. What do I mean? Well, if objectively people are vulnerable, then they're much easier to manipulate. If people don't have enough to eat, they don't have jobs, they don't have health care, they are ridden with insecurity, then a Hitler can come along and use that. Recognize that we are all potential dehumanizers. Learn about the psychological factors that underpin this. Again, I had to pick and choose what I got into. There's a lot in my work about the psychological dispositions that dehumanizing propaganda kind of latches onto. Next, make historical education a priority. Right? We like to think of ourselves, whoever we are, as the exceptions, particularly in the United States, because we've gotten away with all our stuff, right? The Germans didn't get away with it. We got away with all our stuff. But when you learn, everyone has blood on their hands. When you learn these awful aspects of history, which I can assure you, Americans don't learn. I mean, students coming into my courses, they don't have a clue. They really don't. They have like a cartoon version of the history of race in this country. That should elicit a measure of humility. Oh, we've done these things, us. Maybe we're doing it now. Maybe we don't even notice it. And we certainly may do it in the future, rather than think we're above it. And finally, work towards getting rid of the very idea of race. If race is so intimately bound up with this kind of dehumanization, man, I would love to see a world in which race did not exist. That's probably my most controversial statement. No. Well, for you not. For you not, but for a lot of people it is. Okay, so that's the end. This is the sanitation workers' strike in 1968. Notice the white guy doesn't have to have a sign saying, "I'm a man." Okay, so thank you. We have some time for,
Thank you so much for this absolutely illuminating, but really depressing kind of, I don't know, instruction that you gave us.
This was the kids' version.
Where we are. Questions, comments.
I'm happy to give
of-
unsatisfactory responses to questions.
What about the spectacular events of the guillotine in 1790? There were spectacular crowds watching somebody who they considered superior humans.
I didn't quite understand the question.
The French Revolution.
Yeah, the French Revolution.
Oh, yes. So look, dehumanization isn't necessary for atrocity. We can do atrocity without doing dehumanization. Here's why dehumanization is important. Like I said, and here's some of the other ways that we manage to do atrocity. Like I said, we're an ultra-social species. Any social animal has to have inhibitions against lethal violence to community members. And this is just standard. You take an ant colony. Well, they have chemical signals so ants can recognize one another from the same colony. And they don't harm each other. They can't, because you can't maintain a social way of life if you're ripping out each other's throats. Now, human beings are ultra-social. We don't just inhibit violence in our immediate community, but our sociality extends beyond those immediate communities. We know that. We know that, for instance, there were vast trade networks 60,000 years ago. This is a long-standing thing. But we also have these great big brains. And we can think, oh man, wouldn't it be advantageous if we could just exterminate those folks and steal their stuff, or exploit their labor without compensation or whatever. Now, if you think of those two things, the inhibition against lethal violence, I could say a lot about that as well. There's a lot of interesting research on that, juxtaposed with our capacity to think of the advantages that might accrue from committing acts of violence to others, advantages to our little group over here. Then you think, well, that's between a rock and a hard place, right? That's paralysis. Another aspect of human ingenuity was to find cultural means of disabling those inhibitions. Now, dehumanization is one of those, but it's not the only one. There are lots of them, right? There are ways, see, we have remarkable behavioral flexibility, and that's because we have culture. Through culture, we can sort of engineer ourselves to do things which would otherwise not come very easily or would be virtually impossible, right? So yeah, we can go and do all kinds of awful things to people under all kinds of circumstances. Dehumanization is just one way of greasing those wheels.
I would say that in that case, that there was dehumanizing otherness, and it was evil because the kings were an other. They were an unjust ruling class, and so they actually fit into your definition quite well.
Possibly.
And and they were also, they got their power from their parents. It was also, I can't remember the term you used, but it's
Yeah, by
generational.
descent, yes.
By descent, yes.
Well, right, so let me run with that. There is some justification for that, right? So the distinction for some time between peasantry or ordinary folks, we're talking about the 18th century, so it's not just peasants, and royalty, was a quasi-racial distinction, right? So the aristocrats were seen as fundamentally different, deep down in the blood. So yes, I mean, I've not studied this particular example, and I try not to talk out of my ass. So.
Well, I'm sure out of your ass is smarter than
So that's a really good point.
Please.
Yes, just wondering if you connect at all with any of the work of Hardt-Nickachos and on where he's done some research on slavery and labor force, and also some work with Bonhoeffer and what happened to the Jewish population at that time. It just seemed like what you're talking about has some connection.
I've not read a word of Metaxas, but it sounds like I should. So thank you.
You did a quick reference with the one document in 16-something when you said Native American and Black. And through having lived here in Arizona, have had the opportunity to do extensive Native American study. Have you delved into that?
It's one of the many areas that I have.
Because we as Americans have not owned up to that, because there was the big question, could they be baptized? Are they human beings?
Yeah.
And did that enable, reservations, taking them away, for the children to study, and just multiple things?
No, that's true, and that's why Godwin was concerned. He wanted, in fact, he tried to raise funds when he was in Virginia for this big statue of Native American, sort of honoring and memorializing. Of course, he couldn't get funding for it.
But it's really,
yeah, no,
it's
is
not, I mean, it's something, I heard, and I have never heard it one other time. I mean, it's, and I think particularly those of us who live here in Arizona, who are surrounded by them. And it's,
this.
yeah.
I mean, here's one of the problems with dehumanization research. There are too many resources, right? There are so many examples. History is littered with corpses, and a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of it has a dehumanization connection. So it's one of them. I often think to myself, I need to do that very thing.
A thought that popped into my mind that may be totally erroneous, because I'm really not an expert in critical race theory.
I'm not either.
So that makes, we're on equal ground. But as you were talking, I started to think about all of the opponents to critical race theory, which is an attempt, from my very limited knowledge of it, of educating children as to the real history of Americans and slavery,
Yeah.
and what we don't want our white children to feel bad or anything like that. And when you had up there, about education,
Yeah.
and you look at the people who are pushing anti-education of not being able to teach critical race theory, it seems to really fit into keeping blacks in this dehumanized state and protecting that for further discrimination.
No, that's right. So first of all, the vocal opponents of critical race theory mischaracterize critical race theory, which is a branch of legal theory. It's something you might have a seminar on in law school, but it's not high school kids, right? What they call critical race theory is telling the truth about the racial history of the United States. And that's one of many factors that I think, to my mind, makes this topic just so important. This is dangerous stuff.
And it continues with a fervor now.
Yeah.
The back.
I don't need a microphone.
Well, that way it's on the recording.
Yeah.
Came in late, so, but it just seems to me, I feel like, and you're not saying it, but you're kind of skirting that we're in this right now with a political leader that he's not there yet again, but some of this stuff that came up, it's like, oh my gosh, we've been experiencing that a little bit.
Let me be very blunt. I think we're dangerously close to fascism.
I'll take this, then come back to you.
Okay, just two questions actually. And first, I still have this in my head. I can't get Billie Holiday's rendition of
Strange Fruit.
Strange Fruit out of my head right now, so it's haunting. But first question, just a brief question. You mentioned 73% of the lynchings were black men. Were the others predominantly white, or were there other racial categories?
24% were white, and then the remainder were and it gets a bit sketchy here, were Native Americans and Mexicans. But those figures are, all kinds of stuff went on here, out here in the West, that remained unrecorded. So there are probably a lot more of those cases than we know of.
And the other question I want to ask is really, as you know, I study sort of Muslim minorities here in the United States. It's one of my sort of topics. And a lot of scholars have sort of defined Muslims as a racial category.
The category Muslim has been racialized. It's become transformed. Yeah.
Because I'm just questioning with that biological question, though, how do you deal
Well,
with that
it's biological fantasy. It's folk biology, right? Right? It's people who racialize Muslims. In racializing them, think of it as transmitted from parent to offspring, in a concrete, material way.
Thank you so much. I want to build off the comment of this woman in the back of the room. It's a really stunning presentation. I'm thinking about, we are now in the 21st century. The difference between the kind of propaganda we would see in World War II or turn of the century is that we're now in a digital age. I wanted to hear your 2 cents on the dehumanization in the age of social media, and how it seems to me that the crafting creation of monsters in social media in the way of visual memes that travel virally on Facebook, on Twitter, TikTok, now also include women. Women's bodies, women's faces are now rendered monstrous. Monstrosity is no longer the gendered terrain of men.
Yeah, that's interesting, and that's the last point, which I think is a very significant and interesting point. I need to study. So I put it. I try not to fantasize about things. That's the polite version of what I said a little while ago. So yeah, that's good. And I would love, by the way, if you come across examples, I'd love to see them. With respect, though, to the internet, there's a little discussion of this in my book, Making Monsters. So if we look, it's in the chapter on the history of anti-Semitism. So if we go back to like the 13th century, when Jewish people are getting racialized in Europe, These ideas spread very inefficiently. First of all, most people were illiterate, and texts were very difficult to come across, even for those who were literate. So it was visual art and things like passion plays and sermons that spread the dehumanization of Jews. As history unrolls, we get to the 18th century. Well, first we get the printing press, movable type. We get to the 18th century. Literacy in Europe is much more widespread. Then we get these documents, these dehumanizing anti-Semitic documents. That allows a much more efficient spread of these ideological poison. 20th century. What part of the genius of the Nazis was to exploit radio, right? That's even more efficient. In fact, Goebbels, one of Goebbels' projects was to get German engineers to develop an inexpensive radio that ordinary Germans could afford, right? And so, you know, the propaganda could be piped into everyone's home. Now we have the internet. It's even more efficient. So all these means, anything that can spread information can spread misinformation. It's always a double-edged sword, right? So we could say something similar about radio. We could say something similar about literacy. But as they improve, they get more helpful and more dangerous.
You just said something that really made me think. The Nazis had an organized top-down, we're going to use radio for this, but one of the dangers, I think, of the internet is that everybody, regardless of education, has, and it's even more diverse and I think more dangerous myself.
Yeah, I don't know if it's more dangerous, but that's certainly true. It might be, might not be. Maybe the top-down stuff is more dangerous. I don't know.
Well, yeah.
Okay, we have a question here.
So one of the comments or suggestions you made, recommendations you made for a solution to dehumanization was the restudy or the continued study of our history. And I think history has taken a back seat as evidenced by many conversations in our country, particularly among young people, as another check mark, but not another three-dimensional cube I need to absorb the information in. So I certainly that's certainly a very few words in a very strong and long and deep subject that really requires us, if we want to go push back on the latest means of communication, the internet, we want to go push back on other types of dehumanization, to study our history and see what it might teach us.
Well, let's consider this, that the areas of academic life where there is pushback against this sort of stuff, where it's addressed, are twofold. It's the humanities and the social sciences, both of which are low on the totem pole. I mean, the humanities are right at the bottom, right? The humanities are under-resourced, neglected, and that includes history. So history, philosophy, literature even. Literature is very important too. That's dangerous. That's bad. STEM is everything, science and technology, and I love science. I think science is great. I think technology is great too, but it's not everything. And wrapping our minds around these very, very serious issues, and not just wrapping our minds, but wrapping our policies around them, requires the sort of expertise that is starved in the academic world. So I agree with you entirely. Students should not get to university and not know what the word lynching means. And I can tell you, some of my students in my race and racism course don't even know what the word means.
Okay, I've got a question, but I just want to make a quick comment about what you just said about STEM. Yeah, as engineers and scientists, we do need to point out to the public that we've done fantastic things, but we really can't solve all of humanity's problems.
Right.
So my question is, what's sort of the Japanese before and during World War II? And so how does that sort of fit in, and what was their mindset, and have they really acknowledged what they did?
Well, I don't know about really acknowledged. There's a lot that they haven't acknowledged. I know that. And if you look at Japanese wartime propaganda, I got into this into dehumanization through wartime propaganda. And yeah, there are lots and lots and lots of examples of Japanese wartime propaganda dehumanizing the Allies, and vice versa. There's some particularly nasty exterminationist wartime propaganda that was produced by the United States about basically wiping Japanese people off the face of the earth like lice.
Quick last question. If anybody else has something, we can continue a conversation outside, but this will be a last question.
Why are we so susceptible to this, to propaganda? I mean, we don't mind, or we need to find other?
I'm going to give a very, very brief response to that. It's a complicated topic. There are a lot of moving parts to the answer I'd like to give. My view of authoritarian propaganda is actually inspired by Freud and Freud's psychology of religion. So what does Freud say in his 1927 book, The Future of an Illusion, which is about the psychology of religion? Freud says that part of the human condition is that we're aware of our helplessness. We're helpless in the face of the forces of nature, and we're helpless in the face of human injustice. And this sets up in us a craving for salvation. And that craving for salvation, of deliverance from this appalling sense of helplessness, then manifests in religious doctrines. So in the afterlife, the bad people will be punished and the good rewarded, and we won't really die, right? We're covering both sides of that. I think that way of looking at things is very easily transposable to authoritarian politics, and very easily can help us explain our vulnerability to that. So I'm deeply influenced by a paper. It was published in 1941 by a man named Roger Monicarl, based on his experiences listening to Hitler in Germany in 1932. And Monicarl says, look, what he observed Hitler and Goebbels doing, which he then generalizes to all propaganda of this sort, is paradoxically first making the listeners feel really bad. First, making them depressed. Then eliciting paranoid fear in them. And then, having revved up this sense of appalling helplessness and vulnerability, offering a magical solution. That is why, one last comment, and I hope I don't offend the sensibilities of anyone here, but I've been going public on this for years. When Donald Trump announced his candidacy, and he went down that escalator, and I listened to that speech, it followed that playbook to the letter. To the letter. And that's power. That moves people. And we've got to understand how that works. But then we can be vigilant about it.
It moves certain people.
Well, yeah, it does. But it depends. It depends, who you're going to try to move. Yeah, what he did moved certain people, but someone else could come along and push some different buttons that would get to me and get to you. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for this extremely energetic presentation, discussion.
Thank you.
Looks like there's so much more we can talk. I invite all of you to join us for some refreshments outside. Also, please, if you're not yet a friend of the center, please check us, csrc.asu.edu. Please look us up, and please come to all our events. We'd love to continue these conversations. And with your support, and particularly with your attendance, it gives us an energy to keep doing the work we are doing. Thank you, Dr. Smith.
Thank you. I hope that was okay.